In this video, we are going to talk about epistemic internalism and epistemic externalism. So let's start by giving an impression of what internalism and externalism actually are. Now, it's a pretty convoluted debate and many different definitions of these terms are used. I will use the following definition of internalism. An internalist is somebody who believes the following two things. One, that knowledge requires justification, and two, that justification is internal. So knowledge requires justification, and justification is internal. What does internal mean? Well, a little bit further on in the video, I'm going to talk about three different ways in which people have thought about the internal here. But for now, let's focus on one of them. And I'm going to say that justification is internal means that what justifies your belief must be accessible to you, consciously accessible to you, on reflection. So I'm going to illustrate that with an example. Suppose that you claim to believe that there is an elephant outside in the hallway. And I ask you why, right? Why do you believe that? So I ask you to justify your belief. Now, let's say that you come up with three things, three reasons that you have for believing that there's an elephant outside. First of all, you hear this loud, weird trumpeting noise. Second, you looked through the door, you opened the door, looked through it, saw an elephant. Third, you actually brought this elephant up the stairs yourself and left it in the hallway. Okay, so those are the three reasons that you give me. Now, what we might notice about those reasons, or indeed about any reason that you could possibly give me, is that it has to be accessible to you. In the sense that when you started reflecting on why you believe that there's an elephant in the hallway, this popped up in your consciousness, right? You were aware of this. So, one way of thinking about the claim that justification is internal is to think about it in this way. What justifies a belief are other beliefs, probably, that are accessible to us on reflection. So what justifies a belief is accessible to us on reflection. That's one way to understand the claim that justification is internal. So, with these definitions in place, an internalist is somebody who believes that knowledge requires justification, and justification is, some things are justified through things that are accessible to us on reflection. Things that are internal, that are accessible to us on reflection. Okay, so if that's an internalist, then what's an externalist? Well, an externalist is somebody who disagrees with the internalist. And there are two ways for the externalist to disagree with the internalist. They could disagree with the first or with the second claim, right? So they could either say, well, knowledge doesn't require justification at all. Or if they believe that knowledge does require justification, they could say, yeah, but justification is not internal, right? Whatever does the justifying is maybe not, for instance, accessible on reflection. So that's a definition of internalism, a definition of externalism. But in order to get a sort of sense for these positions and why people would have them, I think it's useful to look at some more extended examples. So I am going to introduce first an internalist position, a more detailed internalist position, and then a more detailed externalist position. And in presenting the more detailed internalist position, I'm also going to talk about three different ways in which justification might be internal. And my internalist position, the one that I'm going to present to you as an example, is going to embrace all of them, but an internalist wouldn't have to embrace all of them. Okay, so let's make this picture of internalism and externalism a bit more concrete and at the same time a bit more nuanced and complicated. Okay, here's an example of an internalist position. Let's say that I first of all believe that knowledge requires justification, right? In order to know something, you've got to be justified in believing it. Otherwise, it's just a hunch or something like that. Now, suppose that I further believe that justification means having reasons, right? You're only justified in believing something if you have reasons for it. And when asked what reasons are, I say, well, reasons are beliefs, right? Something can only be a reason for you if you believe it. that there's a trumpeting noise in the hallway can be a reason for your belief that there's an elephant in the hallway, but only if you believe it. Only if you believe that there's a trumpeting noise in the hallway can it be a reason for your belief that there's an elephant in the hallway. Right? So this is the beginning of the picture. Knowledge requires justification. Justification is having reasons for something, and reasons are just further beliefs that stand in an appropriate relation to whatever it is that is to be justified. Okay, now the final element that really makes this an internalist picture is when I say that whether you believe something, that's an internal thing, right? And here's what I might mean by that. I might mean by that beliefs are always accessible on reflection, right? If you wonder whether you believe something, well, you don't have to do some kind of test or go to some belief measuring machine or do any other kind of observation. No, you just have to reflect. Do I believe that I heard a trumpeting noise in the hallway? You think about it, you know whether you believe it. Okay, if you don't know whether you believe it, then you don't believe it. If you know that you don't believe it, then you do not believe it, right? So the idea would be beliefs are internally accessible. So, what we have is the following picture. Knowledge requires justification. Justification is having reasons, but reasons are beliefs, and whether you have beliefs or not, that's an internal matter. It is always going to be internally accessible to you. And so whether you are justified or not in believing something, I might go on to say, depends only on things that are internally accessible to you, right? What you have to check out, you believe something, you wonder, am I justified in believing it? What you have to check out are your reasons, right? What other beliefs do I have? And do they hang together in the right way with this belief? All of that on the picture I'm currently painting is internal, right? That's just something that through thinking, through analysis, I can know about myself. I can know about myself whether I have beliefs backing up this belief, and whether they actually do sort of hang together in the right way, right? Whether they actually, like a trumpeting noise. Why does a trumpeting noise back up the belief that there's an elephant in the hallway? Well, because I also believe that elephants make a trumpeting noise, right? So that's a further element. And all of this together, I mean, I know these beliefs, I see how they hang together. All of that is internally accessible. So that would be an internalist picture. And this internalist picture could be such that the internalist embraces all three major ways in which internalists understand the internal. And I want to talk about those three ways now. I've already talked about the first way in which an internalist might think of internality. It is accessibility on reflection, right? So I might say that justification is internal means that whatever does the justifying is accessible on reflection. And in the position I've just been describing, that's just further beliefs, right? Further beliefs do the justifying, and they are accessible on reflection. That's one way I could think about the internal. Here's a second way I could think about the internal. I could think about certain items as being internal to the mind, right? As existing in the mind. And I might think that way about beliefs. I might think that a belief is a mental state, that it exists in the mind, that it is sort of metaphysically internal in that sense, right? It's just part of the mind or part of the subject or something like that. It doesn't have anything to do with the external world. Okay, so that's a second way I might think about the internal. And when I say that justification is internal, what I might mean is that whatever does the justification is an internal item. It is an item that is completely within the mind or within consciousness or within the subject or something like that. Not quite the same thing, maybe, as being accessible on reflection. Although some people might believe it's the same thing. But, you know, it's not necessary that you believe that they're the same thing. So it's really a second way of thinking about what it is to be internal. A third way of thinking about what it is to be internal has more to do with normativity. And we can understand it or get a sense of it by thinking about the idea of responsibility. Right? Suppose that I say, well, you know, you're justified when you believe something responsibly. well, what do I have to do in order to believe something responsibly? Well, I have to do the best I can, right? And the best I can, not so much in the sense that I have to do the best that it is possible to do, right? In the sense that, suppose that somebody living in the Middle Ages believes that the sun moves around the earth, right? Somebody in the Middle Ages believes that the sun moves around the earth. They could be completely responsible in believing that, right? I mean, everything they've learned about the universe, about the earth and the sun and so on, all of that fits the idea that the sun moves around the earth and the earth is standing still. So they could be responsible. They are not thinking in the best way possible, right? We have a better way of thinking about it, but they're thinking in the best way that's available to them at that moment, right? Given what they know and what they've learned. So that's the kind of responsibility I'm thinking about, not so much the kind where you would say, oh no, I mean, that's not the best way of thinking because we have a better way. Okay, so the way I'm thinking about responsibility then is I'm thinking about it sort of internally. I'm stepping into the shoes of the person who is believing something, and I wonder, well, are they doing their best? Right? Is it reasonable to believe this from their perspective? And if it's yes, then I say, well, they're justified. Right? The medieval person is justified in believing that the sun moves around the earth, and I wouldn't be justified in believing that. On the contrary, I mean, I am justified in believing that the earth moves around the sun, for instance, or that the two of them together move around their the center of gravity of the entire system. Anyway, here we have a third notion of internality, right? And this has to do not with accessibility. It doesn't have to do with something being inside the mind. It has to do with an internal perspective on something, right? That we should evaluate and judge justification purely based on the perspective of the person who is or is not justified. And again, I mean, there are links to the other types of internality, right? You might believe that, it's only what is accessible to you in reflection that plays a role in your perspective. And maybe it is, right? We don't have to sort of decide here what the relations between these three kinds of internality are. All of them play a role in the debate. It's good to have heard of them. And, you could be an internalist who embraces all of that. So the type of internalism I just described a little bit earlier might embrace all of it, right? I might say, well, beliefs are justified by other beliefs. Beliefs are accessible in reflection. Beliefs are purely mental entities. And when you think about justification in this way, you're taking up a purely personal perspective from the inside. Okay, so I could say all of that. I don't have to, right? I could claim that actually beliefs are not internal mental entities or something like that, but that they are accessible in reflection. Not going to worry about those kinds of subtleties. So that is an example of internalism, and it has allowed us to think through different conceptions of the internal. Now, an example of externalism. I'm going to use a theory that we already briefly discussed when we talked about analyses of knowledge. It's going to be reliabilism. Now, a standard version of reliabilism might say the following. It might say that knowledge is true belief acquired through a reliable method. True belief acquired through a reliable method. So justification is not mentioned. The reliabilist does not believe that knowledge depends on justification. Knowledge depends on having used a reliable method. And what is crucial for reliabilism, and what makes reliabilism an externalist position, is that the only thing that's relevant about this reliable method is that it is reliable. That it does in fact usually lead to true answers. Okay, that it does in fact usually lead to true answers. What is not important is whether I know that, whether I am aware of having used this method, whether I am aware of the reliability of this method, and so on. Right? It is just the method itself that we evaluate, and not my internal relation to that method. And so, because the method itself has nothing to do, in a sense, with what I believe about it or know about it, what plays a role here in the analysis of knowledge instead of justification is something that is external, right? Something that has nothing to do with what is accessible to me on reflection. It has nothing to do with items that are purely in the mind. And it has nothing to do with this purely internal perspective, where we just take up somebody's own view from the inside, so to speak. No. If we want to know whether somebody has knowledge, we just check out whether they have used a reliable method, yes or no. And we don't worry about like their own relationship to that method. So, an externalist might reject all three kinds of the internal that the internalist is talking about, in the sense that the externalist might believe that none of that stuff is interesting for epistemology. Right? An externalist might say that epistemologists shouldn't care about internal access, they shouldn't care about mental entities, they shouldn't care about this sort of perspective of like this internal perspective. No, what we are interested in epistemology is knowledge. What we're interested in is therefore reliable methods, and those are to be assessed on their own without looking at the internal states of the subject, so to speak. So here we have two very different ways of thinking about what epistemology should be doing, right? I mean, should we take up this internal perspective and look at reasons and what is accessible to us in the mind and so on? Or should we like focus our view on things like reliable methods and not worry about like the consciousness of the subject? Well, how do we decide between that? Okay, so one option is to, and this won't come as a surprise, is to try to look for counterexamples, right? Maybe we can find things where the externalist is going to say, oh, you have knowledge, but you actually don't have knowledge, or the other way around. And maybe we can find counterexamples for internalism too. Well, yes, that's what philosophers have been doing. I mean, just like with the analyses of knowledge, for instance, that's what philosophers have been doing with internalism and externalism too. And I want to discuss two examples. One that is supposed to work against externalism, one that is supposed to work against internalism. Okay, let's start with the one that's supposed to work against externalism. Suppose that John has a sort of prophetic gift. Maybe it's been given to him by a supernatural power. And the gift is this. As soon as John considers which football team will win the next match, he gets an overwhelming belief, and that belief is always true. So John, he just gets a belief. He doesn't get any reasons for the belief, he just gets the belief, and it's always true. If he thinks about who is going to win the next like Dutch football game, is it going to be FC Utrecht or is it going to be PSV? Immediately, he has a belief and it's always going to be true. But John doesn't know that he has this gift. He hasn't even noticed that he's particularly reliable at this because he isn't interested in football. Right? He never thinks about football. He never thinks about the next football match. So he has no evidence of his own reliability. But now he meets his... let's say that he's talking to his girlfriend, Hannah. So Hannah is saying, oh, I'm so interested in the next football match. Who is going to win? And, John usually doesn't think about football matches, but now he does. And he says, oh, well, your favorite team is going to win. And Hannah says, how do you know? And John says, oh, well, I just believe it. Does John know who is going to win the next football match? Okay, those who bring forward this example as a counterexample to externalism are going to say, no, I mean, John doesn't know, right? It's just a hunch. He doesn't have any reasons to believe it. It's just a hunch. He is actually not acting very responsibly in believing this. It's just a hunch. This does not rise to the level of knowledge. But he has used a perfectly reliable method. He just doesn't know that he has used that method, and he doesn't know that this method is reliable. Right? And so what we are invited to do, we're invited to say, oh yeah, I have a strong intuition that John doesn't have knowledge, and so the externalist is wrong. And maybe that is what we want to say. On the other hand, many externalists would say, well, if that's your intuition is wrong. So it's hard to decide anything, right, based on this type of counterexample. But it's a counterexample that has gotten a fair bit of discussion. Okay, let's look at a counterexample on the other side. A counterexample that is supposed to show that the internalist is in trouble. Okay, this one is going to be a bit more involved because I want to look at both a sort of positive and a negative scenario. So here's the positive scenario where we might want to say, yes, I did get some knowledge. So suppose that I once looked up the Wikipedia page of Karl Marx and I read about his brothers and sisters and I got the belief that Karl Marx had brothers. And then I forget about reading this Wikipedia page. And a year later somebody says, hey, did Marx have any brothers? And I say, oh yeah. He says, well, how do you know? I said, I have no idea how I know it, but I know that Marx had some brothers. This is not a particularly weird example, right? I mean, this kind of stuff happens to us all the time. We learn things, we remember it, but we don't remember how we learned it. And so what the externalist wants to say is two things. First of all, they want to say, well, you have knowledge, right? You really do know that Marx had brothers. But internalism is going to be wrong about this because your reasons are not accessible to you. Right? Your justification is not accessible to you on reflection because you forgot it. Okay, so what does the internalist do? Well, the internalist can really sort of do two different things, right? One thing is to say, well, in that case, you don't really know. That's a heavy option because it's going to exclude a lot of knowledge that we have. Or that we think we have. Or the internalist can say, well, actually, I mean, you read Wikipedia. That was something that you did consciously. So you formed your belief in what is for the internalist a really fine way. And yeah, sure, okay, you forgot it. But that just shows that we have to see internalism as somehow kind of like spread out over time. Right? I mean, it was internal. That's good enough. That's also a road that the internalist could walk. So this kind of counterexample, it doesn't really sort of show, it doesn't really prove that internalism is wrong or that externalism is right or that, there's leeway there. Okay, let's look at a twist of this counterexample. Suppose that I get the belief that Marx has brothers, but I get it in a different way, a much worse way. Because I'm at a party and somebody says, hey, did Marx have any brothers? And another person says, yeah, he had brothers because did Karl Marx have any brothers? And somebody says, yeah, Karl Marx had some brothers because, he was part of a comedy troupe called the Marx Brothers. And I think, oh yeah, Karl Marx was part of a comedy troupe called the Marx Brothers. So he had some brothers. And it's only the last thing that I remember. I mean, that's only the only thing that gets stored in my mind is that Marx had brothers. I don't remember this conversation at all. I don't remember the connection to the Marx Brothers, who have nothing to do with Karl Marx. So this is what I remember. And then a year later, somebody said, hey, does Marx have any brothers? And I said, yeah, Karl Marx had some brothers. And they said, well, how do you know? And I said, I can't remember, but I've learned this fact. I know that Marx had some brothers. So here it seems that we would like to say that Marx that I do not know that Marx had any brothers. And yet internally the situation seems to be kind of the same as the previous situation. I forgot all about it. In the one circumstance I had good reasons for my belief, in the other I had bad reasons for my belief, but I've forgotten the reasons. So internally it looks the same, and yet we might want to say that in one case I have knowledge and in the other case I don't have knowledge. Okay, and so internalism might be wrong. And again, the internalist could say something like, well, you have to extend internalism over time, maybe. Or they can try some other, way of tweaking their position in order to account for this. All right. So I'm going to leave the attempt to decide who is right there. And if you look at the literature between internalism and externalism, you're not going to find any consensus, but you are going to find a very detailed, intricate discussion with many different kinds of internalism and externalism and many examples of the kind I just talked about. And I think reading such literature can sometimes be a little bit dispiriting. In fact, it can be almost despair-inducing, or it can turn you into somebody who's pretty cynical about these kinds of debates. Because you might get the feeling that these people are just sort of talking past each other, maybe, the internalist and the externalist. maybe they're just talking about different things, right? And they come up with these counterexamples and examples, and they just, change their theories a little so that they don't work anymore. And maybe they're just debating definitions and nobody's really right or wrong. And how anyway are we going to find out who is right or wrong? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any very solid ground to stand on. These kind of debates can be the kind of debates where if you delve into them a bit, you start wondering whether they are really about anything, whether there's any truth to be gained. And maybe you go as far as to wonder whether modern epistemology is worth it, worth your time, and so on. Now, what I think is that these debates can sometimes become so technical that it's hard to keep in mind what the point is. So, as soon as we start to lose sight of what the point is, what we need to do is we need to take a few steps back and look at the point. I mean, what is at stake here? And even if it turns out there might not be a sort of clear method for finding out whether the internalist or the externalist is right, it could be the case that the kind of discussions that we have when we compare internalism to externalism help us think through the kind of stuff that is at stake in the debate. And so what I want to do in the next video is I want to take that step backwards, and I want to talk about some of the things that are at stake in the debate between the internalist and the externalist. And I think they're very interesting things that are at stake. And maybe the best way to understand what's going on in the debate is that the internalist and the externalist are sort of trying to find out who is right. But it could also be the case that, instead they're trying to develop two different views of epistemology, both of which might be valuable and which might even inform each other. So let's look at that in our next video.